Chang.
My Lords, the Cameroon is in the grip of a humanitarian disaster that threatens to affect it and indeed the whole region. The Anglophone communities in that country see their rights, see their expectations of a prosperous and safe life trampled underfoot. My Lords, this crisis has its origins in a plebiscite of 1961, which I, in my own childhood, in the region at the time, recall as being of concern then, certainly to the region, to my father, who was a cabinet minister in a neighboring country, but also and significantly to members of this House and the other place, who saw in a flawed plebiscite that posed simply a binary question to the English-speaking regions of the Cameroon: join Nigeria or join Francophone Cameroon. That was the choice that was given them. They were not given the choice to form their own independent state. My Lords, we live with the legacy of that plebiscite in the plight of the peoples of the Cameroon and the English-speaking peoples of the Cameroon in particular to this day. And the horrific figures, my Lords, speak for themselves. 460,000 peoples displaced. 3.3 million peoples in need of humanitarian assistance. More than 450 innocent civilians killed in the course of the conflict in the Anglophone regions, countless separatist fighters and government soldiers killed, murdered, often in horrific circumstances. Only this morning, my Lords, I met with someone whose family member was giving assistance to a government soldier who had seen the heads of 4 of his comrades displayed on the road when he returned to the place where those soldiers had gathered. He has gone mad, and not surprisingly. There have been atrocities committed on both sides. As we speak, people are held without trial. People have disappeared, kidnapped, in a dirty war out of which no one comes with any credit at all. And the question is, my Lords, what is to be done? And the answer has to be, surely we have to engage. We've had and heard numerous expressions of concern by Her Majesty's government. Concern is welcome, my Lords, but concern is not enough. The time has come to engage with some specific purpose. And that purpose surely has to be to inculcate a national dialogue, a genuinely national dialogue within the Cameroon that is designed to address those grievances which are real and which are continuing, grievances that led some years ago now, because the situation has been deteriorating over the last 2-3 years in particular, grievances that led lawyers to go on strike, that led teachers to go on strike because the protections that they had secured from the original federalist solution that followed the plebiscite had been so dissipated that Anglophone students were at a disadvantage when they took exams, that cases could not properly be heard in the courts, because Francophone judges were adjudicating on law, the common law of which they had no knowledge, in languages which were improperly translated. All of that led to the increasing marginalization of the English-speaking peoples of the Cameroon. In no other country in the world is an English-speaking linguistic minority discriminated against and disadvantaged as they are in the Cameroon. And how can this House, regardless of its historical responsibilities as the holders of the mandate, which led to the creation of a federal Cameroon after independence, regardless of our responsibilities there, how can we stand by to see English peoples discriminated in this way? But equally, how can we stand by with the universal right that we are obliged to accept, the rights of people to protection? How can we stand by and allow this to happen? So what we hope to hear from the government tonight are the practical measures that they are going to take in order to address this issue. We have, my lords, an excellent High Commissioner in the Cameroon. How is that High Commissioner to be supported by additional resource? We have a commitment, after all, which we have made, and the government has been very clear about that, to increase the resources available in order to ensure that the Foreign Office is able to guarantee the right of protection against atrocity. Are these resources going to be made available to the High Commission in the Cameroon? Because they cannot do it on the resources currently allocated for that purpose. There is upcoming, later on this month, an Anglophone General Conference in the Cameroon, organized by the Cameroonian religious leaders, scheduled for the 21st and the 22nd of November. How are we to support that as a nation with resource? How are we going to encourage the government of the Cameroon to engage with religious leaders in that conference? And crucially, are we also going to seek to encourage the separatist movements also to engage? Because innocent people are being caught between a rock and a hard place. The separatists on the one hand, who terrorize them, the government on the other, who also terrorize them and who at the same time fail to protect them. My lords, let me declare an interest in this particular concern. I chair two charities that are currently working in the Cameroon. The Minister of State for Africa, rightly in my view, referred to the long-standing friendship between our peoples, the British peoples, and the Cameroon, and the fact that we are partners in the Commonwealth. That long-standing friendship has caused Bouquet International, previously the Countess Ramphurly Library Trust, to have worked in the Cameroon since 1962. We have worked in both the English-speaking Cameroon and in the French-speaking Cameroon. We are now, it is a charity, my lords, that trains librarians and provides books. It helped me as a little boy growing up in the Gold Coast and then Ghana by founding the first dedicated children's library in sub-Saharan Africa. We are now no longer able, my lords, to work in English-speaking Cameroon. Such is the impact on education in those provinces. Similarly, my lords, I chair the International Council of the Duke of Edinburgh's Award. We have had a long-standing relationship with the Cameroon. We work closely with ministries in the Cameroon, with civil society in the Cameroon. We are no longer able to work in the English-speaking Cameroon. That is the reality on the ground, and something has to be done. My lords, let me just close my remarks by allowing the peoples of the English-speaking Cameroon really to speak for themselves. One child who describes how she and her family have had to take to the forest in order to be safe, both from the government troops and from the separatists. Her education has been disrupted. She has no access to what we would expect any child to have. This is what she says: "I will not be able to go back to my village and school, which have been burnt down. The forest is now my home. The forest is now my home. There are no schools or books there. I still have hopes to go to school and read books again." My Lords, Book Aid International, with the support, we have no government support, we don't ask for government support. We are supported by publishers who provide brand new books. We are supported by British people, ordinary British people. And we are supported in this particular instance, because of the difficulty of working in the Cameroon at this time, we are supported by the People's Postcode Lottery, to whom I give great thanks and credit. As a result of that, we are able to send, and have sent now, 5,000 brand new publisher-donated books to be distributed not as they normally are, through schools, through libraries, but to be distributed in the forests, on the roads, in the camps and places where these displaced children are. And to be distributed, it must be said, with the aid of brave local partners. And the churches, my lords, are in the forefront of this. And this is what one bishop has to say: "We believe that we can give these children hope in a hopeless situation. Dreams should not end because there is strife and conflict. But unless we right the wrongs now for these children so they can learn today, there will be no tomorrow for them and their communities." There will be no tomorrow for them and their communities. How, my lords, I ask this of the government, are we to support the Commonwealth or the Africa Union to hold the ring in the national conversation that the President of the Cameroon has promised in order to address these long-standing grievances and current abuses of human rights on all sides? How is Her Majesty's government going to support the Commonwealth and the African and/or the Africa Union, and what resources are they going to make available for that purpose? It will not be enough to call upon them to do something unless we actually give them the resources, unless within the councils of the Commonwealth, the Ministerial Council, we exercise the political will to which the people of the Cameroon are entitled to look to Her Majesty's government to exercise. My lords, we have a choice. We cannot revisit the wrongs of yesteryear in the plebiscite, in the flawed referendum and all of that, in the withdrawal from imperial responsibility. We cannot revisit that to any useful purpose. But what we can do is to assure that these children and these communities do have a tomorrow.
Thank you, my lords. I will try not to repeat any of the very clear and passionate points made by the Noble Lord Boateng about the current situation and the recent developments in the Cameroon. Suffice to say that I fully support his call for UK engagement in this situation, not least because of our historical responsibilities for the actions in 1961, and also, I think, a degree of abandonment thereafter when the federal system was abandoned in 1972. But I wanted to add four points, if I can do that briefly, to the discussion this evening. The first is that I think here, while there is a role for the United Kingdom, there also has to be a role for the African Union. Many of us have welcomed over the years the shift in the African Union from the old policy of non-interference in the practices of the governments of the Member States of the old Organisation of African Unity to the new policy of non-indifference in the African Union, where there is a more interventionist, at least in theory, approach to these kinds of situations. And it does seem to me that where there has been success over recent years in tackling human rights abuses, the potential for atrocities and the prevention of atrocities, then it has been where the region and the continent have been more actively engaged than the international community. The second point I wanted to make is that I think here there is yet another lesson for the ambitions that the government claims to have in relation to a global Britain post-Brexit. If we are to increase our resources in the Foreign Office, and if we are to have a more active international policy, then I believe it has to have human rights and atrocity prevention at its core. We have that responsibility in the UN Security Council, but we also have it as a nation, given our historical responsibilities for our colonial past. And I believe that the government must ensure that human rights and atrocity prevention are at the heart of the new policy of global Britain. And I would be interested to know in the Minister's response this evening what the government have assessed in relation to atrocity prevention, and what has been the approach of, for example, the responsibility to protect focal point in the Foreign Office. What is their response and their attitude to this situation, and how much worse it could become? The third point I wanted to make is in relation to the, I think, crucial politics of this situation. And I want to generalise here far beyond the Cameroon. Because if we look around the world today, almost every major conflict today is based on an identity clash between a majority and a minority. Much of them created by borders that were defined either by the end of World War I or by the end of colonisation in the 50s and the early 60s. But many of them elsewhere still raging without any engagement of any of the European former colonial powers. And if we look at Myanmar, or we look at the Philippines, where I have been involved as an advisor to the peace process in Mindanao, registered in my Lord's Register of Interests, or we look at the former Soviet states in the Ukraine and elsewhere, or we look in the Middle East, or we look across large parts of Africa in medium-sized and large states, we see a conflict today between a majority and a minority, where the minority, rightly or wrongly, in most cases rightly, feels persecuted and disadvantaged by the majority, and where the majority fear the minority and therefore will not concede power. And it seems to me that the system that was, at least in theory, designed for the Cameroon back in the late 50s and early 1960s, and that prompted the decision of the southern Cameroonians to choose being part of Cameroon rather than Nigeria in that plebiscite, that system of a federated government has to be the kind of political solution that has to exist be promoted around the world in order to ensure that these conflicts are not just contained, but are actually resolved in the long term. Unless people have a political voice, a representation of their identity, and an opportunity to govern themselves and influence the rest of the country in an appropriate way, then these conflicts and the underlying causes of them will not end. Whether that's in some parts of Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, in the former Soviet states, Southeast Asia, or anywhere else. And I think the British government, along perhaps with other European partners, could be making a more effective intervention on this. We have a history of devolution and a political settlement in Northern Ireland, bringing to an end a violent conflict there. And we have a history in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK of creating political devolution in a peaceful way. And in both of these instances, we have lessons that we could take elsewhere in the world and use to help prevent conflict and sustain peace. And I think perhaps as part of this global Britain approach that we're promised post-Brexit, that is one of the initiatives that could be at its heart.
My Lords, may I firstly congratulate Lord Boateng on giving us the opportunity to raise these issues concerning Cameroon, which are so important in our overall philosophy of the developments of Africa. My Lord, since independence in 1961, there followed a long period of economic migration back and forth between Cameroon and Nigeria, together with asylum seekers fleeing from Boko Haram, perhaps inevitably in the war between Cameroon's army and the Islamist militant group. But since 2015, Cameroon has forcibly removed, apparently, tens of thousands of asylum seekers back to northeast Nigeria, despite warnings that the region remains unsafe from Boko Haram attacks. And in March 2017, concerns about forced returns led Nigeria, Cameroon, and the UNHCR to sign an agreement for the voluntary repatriation of Nigerian refugees living in Cameroon. The agreement states, my lords, that repatriation of Nigerian refugees will be done solely on the basis of their freely expressed will, and will only be done when the conditions are favourable for the return of the refugees in safety and dignity to the place of their final destination in Nigeria. Yet in September 2017, Human Rights Watch reported that over 100,000 Nigerian refugees were deported from Cameroon in the hope of stemming the spread of Boko Haram, defying a plea from the UN Refugee Agency not to return anyone to northeast Nigeria, where Boko Haram had killed thousands of people. Again, according to Human Rights Watch, the Cameroonian military torture and abuse of Nigerian refugees seems to be driven by an arbitrary decision to punish them for Boko Haram attacks in Cameroon and to discourage Nigerians from seeking asylum. It is still not safe to drive from Cameroon into places like the border towns of Pulka and Banki, say leaders of the Borneo Community Coalition, who assist IDPs. This is the Borno Community Coalition. The attacks on returnees should prove to Cameroon that forcing refugees back to Nigeria could lead them to their deaths. Last week, the fury created by reports that as many as 100 students have been kidnapped from a Presbyterian secondary school subsided to a large degree when the true figure of some 11 was apparently confirmed on their release. Separatists fighting for independence of the two English-speaking regions condemned the kidnapping in Bamenda and accused the government of staging the incident. On the 5th of November, the Journal du Cameroun reported that the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ, was exhorting the government to stop intimidating journalists in the country. Angela Quintal, the CPJ's Africa Programme Coordinator, said that over the last year, Cameroon journalists have been repeatedly summoned simply for doing their work. In many cases, these summonses resulted in detentions. This pattern of intimidation, she said, must end. Before the London CHOGM, the CPA UK branch hosted a visit of a parliamentary delegation from Cameroon. The delegation was led by the Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly of the Cameroon, the Honourable Emilia Monjoa Liaka. The tension between Anglophone and Francophone areas of Cameroon were discussed, particularly the disparity between the French and English legislative and legal systems operating in different parts of the country. The delegation stated that as a minority of the population came from the English-speaking community, there was less demand and therefore less incentive to provide trained officials, specialists in the English legal and legislative systems, leading to a shortage of these personnel. Well, the Honourable Emilia Monjoa Liaka later attended the opening of the plenary session of the London CHOGM as the newly elected chair of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association's International. Referring to the CHOGM themes of fairness, prosperity, security and sustainable development, she said, and I quote, "There can be no peace without fairness. There can be no meaningful development without peace. There can be no security without peace, and therefore no nation can prosper without fairness, peace and security. Well, as the chair of the Commonwealth All-Party Parliamentary Group, may I ask the Minister, in her reply, if she can say what advice she might give to the chair of the CPA International on how her wise words might well be applied to her own parliament, as well as the Commonwealth at large. And with the Anglophone conflict edging towards civil war, will the Minister urge dialogue between the separatists and the government of Cameroon as a means of halting escalation? And will she call for support for an Anglophone General Conference able to negotiate with the government of the Cameroon, breaking their reliance on a military campaign to crush the rebels? And will the Minister, finally, also confirm that she will urge the government of the Cameroon to reflect that as signatories to the Commonwealth Charter, they too are committed to helping to establish and apply human rights throughout the Commonwealth in accordance with the Latimer principles?
My Lord, Cameroon has the hallmarks of the region and world sleepwalking into another humanitarian disaster, even beyond that that we are witnessing today. My past visits to Cameroon, my Lords, have been to assess the appropriateness of a key agricultural investment in the French-speaking north. I begin with my conclusion and a possible way forward, but not before commending Lord Boateng for securing a debate on this rapidly deteriorating situation and his powerful intervention. It is terrible and so sad that these wounds have resurfaced. But I fear it was always going to be thus, with the exclusion of the English-speaking minority in the affairs of state. The only practical solution, from distance, is a political settlement with either a United Nations or African Union peacekeeping contingent being placed on the ground to enable an immediate cessation of violence, ensuring a humanitarian protective intervention, and a cooling-off period to create the conditions to allow an equitable settlement to be hammered out. Building on lessons learnt, autonomy but not separation in a close-knit federation is the formula for lasting peace and should be embraced as a solution. I have not tracked the papers that explained why this was not contained in the 1961 plebiscite when divesting from southern Cameroon. The Minister could usefully shed light into the thinking of the day and as to why not. Is the government satisfied that sufficient regard was paid to sensitivities, responsibilities and their consequences by our forebears? The Minister may wish to comment on the background of the 6th of November 2018 ruling in favour of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office regarding the legality of the original plebiscite. November the 6th this year, my Lords. I do wonder if the right question was before the court. I will refer to the Cairo Declaration and the subsequent Constitutive Act of the African Union. What was always and still is envisaged as an acceptable solution to the English language-speaking people of Cameroon was a choice of a federation made up of two states with equal status. My Lords, I'm not critical of London in isolation. The Quai d'Orsay possibly pressed what it considered to be an advantage by not containing this key option in restricting the alternatives to a choice between Nigeria or French Cameroon. Importantly, the 1964 Cairo Declaration on African Borders, reaffirmed in Article 4B of the Constitutive Act of the African Union, however, and signed off by the President of Cameroon, makes clear that demarcation of the territory of each African state is recognized as being such on the date of its independence. Does the United Kingdom government accept this to be the case? Or not? Has there been subsequent declarations that nullify these issues on borders? If not, it would follow that French Cameroon and Ambazonia are both able to assert territorial integrity. At no time before or after its independence from France was the southern Cameroon's part of that country known by its French name and style as La République du Cameroon. A solution would be a close-knit federation made up of two entities and thus ensuring no parting of the ways. The question of the legitimacy of territorial integrity superseding that of self-determination would not be relevant in this instance. An international boundary separating French Cameroon from the southern Cameroons existed, affirmed in the Anglo-French Boundary Treaty of 1916 and confirmed in 1931. And if that be the case, would it not follow that the territory of the southern Cameroonians be recognised sitting alongside that of French Cameroon? An integral part of a peace formula lies with France, my lords. Given the David and Goliath nature of the situation in Cameroon, I asked the Minister on what occasions has the British Prime Minister or Foreign Secretary brought this up as a matter with the French President or the Quai d'Orsay. On the multilateral front, we should not forget that Cameroon is a Commonwealth member. Indeed, it was always envisaged by the Secretariat that the Commonwealth would take the wind out of the sail of secession. Membership was pressed for by Ambazonians against the will of Paris, with France unsurprisingly mightily resisting Cameroon's application to Commonwealth membership. When Baroness Scotland, the Commonwealth SG Secretary-General, visited Yaoundé in December 2017, President Biya recalled all the measures taken by his government to appease the situation in the northwest and southwest regions. He reiterated his willingness to dialogue, but that he stood also firm on his determination to, and I quote, restore order. The Commonwealth must surely now regain some of its focus, with the UK pressing the Commonwealth to serve more of a purpose in Cameroon than just monitoring elections. On a practical and an immediate imperative, my lords, is to effect measures to end the atrocities by the military. What is being done to stem the refugee flows into Nigeria? The halting of the burning down of over 100 towns and villages? The forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of women and children and the elderly into the forests, hills and bushes, and the dislocation of the livelihood of others. Let this debate, my lords, introduced by Lord Boateng, be the catalyst for all sides to sit together before yet another series of continuing calamitous events befalls the world.
My lords, I would like unreservedly to thank and congratulate my noble friend Lord Boateng for having taken up this cause. To have someone with his experience and insight leading on our concerns is magnificent. I also thought he introduced the subject with terrific effect and considerable passion in the best sense. Whereas I have a personal affection for Cameroon because as a young man, the first country in Africa that I visited, the first time I visited Africa, I visited, as part of my journey, Senegal and Cameroon. I remember being struck then by the immense difference in the whole character and tradition and life between West Cameroons and French Cameroons. I was bewildered as to how administrators thought that these two communities made a natural combined entity. I just didn't see it. My lords, this is an auspicious day, as all our days are, in terms of our own domestic history in the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. There are lessons here. You can't fix these things by an imposed agreement. These things have to grow out of a commitment and will and understanding of the different parties to the situation. And if I'm allowed to continue digressing for a moment, that is what's so desperately sad about the situation in Northern Ireland, because within the context of the European Union, there was a sense of equivalence the minority population had the reassurance of the European institutions in their talks with their colleagues and fellow Northern Irish citizens. And large numbers of people were working away at building a future and building a peace, and we've got to get that right. But, my lords, on this subject itself, I'm particularly struck because today I've just had news of a recent ugly event in Bamenda. The Presbyterian school there, secondary school there, Quinn, has seen 79 children, school children, abducted. And the headmaster and another key individual are missing, whereabouts unknown. Also, an American missionary by the name of Charles Wesco has been killed. Bamenda was one of the key places I visited when I was in West Cameroon, and I rather think that this is the school at which I received warm hospitality at the time. My lords, noble Lord Bertain, my noble friend Lord Bertain, said it was time that we passed the time for urging and speaking about our concern. We need action. And in that context, he concentrated on some of the things that could be done. And he mentioned the very soon to occur Anglophone General Conference for Cameroons, organised by church and other religious leaders in the community. This is to be on the 21st and 22nd November. We need an answer tonight as to what the British government is doing, not what they think about it, but what they're doing, actually doing, to make enable that conference to be a success. What support they have provided directly and indirectly. If they haven't, why haven't they? All the professions of goodwill and concern become rather unpleasant, actually, if in the context of things that are really happening, they're constructive and hopeful, nothing has been done. And then my noble friend talked to the people going into the forest and the implications of that. And what are we doing? What are we doing about shelter and non-food items, about food security, about health, vulnerable people at risk in the forest? What are we doing about water, sanitation and hygiene? What are we doing about gender-based violence? And what are we doing about education? My lords, this is the time for action and the evidence of action. It's not a time for being told yet again that we are concerned. What are we doing, and what are we doing in the Commonwealth that professes to give priority to conflict resolution? What are we doing at the UN? And while we're still in the European Union, what are we doing with our European Union partners?
Appreciative to the noble Lord Boateng for giving the House the opportunity to debate the plight of the English-speaking minority in Cameroon, and for the passionate and eloquent way in which he set the scene. The roll call of suffering is horrendous and a harbinger of even worse to come if, as the noble Lord Judd has just reminded us, we fail to act. In Nigeria, there are nearly 27,000 refugees from Cameroon registered with the UNHCR. Thousands more have been forced to flee their homes, and dozens of villages have been ethnically cleansed. According to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and High Commissioner for Refugees, 437,000 from the Anglophone regions have been displaced, whilst the charity Protection Approaches says that 3.3 million are in need of humanitarian assistance. Amnesty reports that 450 to 500 civilians and 185 members of the security services have been killed. UNICEF estimates that 58 schools have been destroyed. 47 political leaders are being held without charge. And a recent Amnesty report refers to, and I quote, arbitrary arrests, torture, unlawful killings, and the destruction of property. The Catholic Bishops' Conference has called it, quote, inhuman, blind, monstrous violence. And of the October election, Archbishop Samuel Cleder, the president of the Bishops' Conference, says, one has the impression election results are decided before voting takes place. My lords, we can all share in these horrendous statistics, but what I want to do is this evening focus on what conclusions we can draw from the United Kingdom's dismal approach to this situation. More than ever, with Britain's potential departure from the European Union, we must seek to define our role in the world. And it would be helpful to know from the Noble Baroness the Minister whether, for instance, human rights issues were assessed before, for instance, the New Age natural gas deal was announced, what consideration has been given to targeted sanctions, and whether this crisis figures in the Foreign Secretary's recent commitment on atrocity prevention. My lords, the government mustn't suggest that this is a level playing field conflict in a civil war between equal sides. Too often in the past, in Bosnia, in Rwanda, in Darfur, the United Kingdom chose the path of moral equivalence, hinting that both sides were as bad as each other is the easy way out. In a previous generation, this was known as appeasement. Moral equivalence signals that we cannot be expected to pass judgment on which side is more to blame for the conflict. Instead, we issue the usual calls for a cessation of violence and a negotiated settlement, or we frame political conflicts as if they were natural disasters requiring aid, and we're very generous at sending aid rather than political solutions. At its worst, in Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur, we have portrayed the persecution of unarmed civilians by repressive governments as a result of ancient ethnic hatreds, thereby dehumanizing the victims and denying the legitimacy of the protesters who yearn for the rights that we take for granted. By citing ancient ethnic hatreds, we absolve ourselves of the obligation under international law to stop the killing. It's also disingenuous to defend our tepid response by claiming that the circumstances present us with a simple binary choice between wringing our hands in dismay or putting British boots on the ground. This is to ignore the potential for soft power available to the international community, be it concerted and sustained diplomatic pressure, carefully targeted sanctions, or international justice. The grievances fueling the violence in Cameroon did not erupt overnight. We had plenty of warning, but we chose not to listen to Cameroon's Anglophone minority. Anglophones represent 20% of the population, but for years there was only one Anglophone member of the 36-person cabinet in Yaoundé, just one example of their systematic marginalisation. My lords, we shouldn't underestimate the influence we have, but it speaks volumes that we left it to the American ambassador to express his disapproval of the Cameroonian government's brutal response to peaceful protests. For decades, the Francophone government has ignored the pleas of moderate representatives of civil society, such as church leaders. Calls for a federal solution were ignored by President Biya 36 years in power, fueling the calls for secession and thereby polarising opinion. Breaking point came when the Francophone government sought to impose French laws in the French language in Anglophone courts and sent Francophone teachers speaking French into English schools. They responded to peaceful protest with disproportionate force. The International Crisis Group reports that a government helicopter, for instance, hovered outside a church, shooting Anglophone worshippers as they emerged from Mass. Inevitably, disproportionate actions led to the current escalation. In the face of all this, my lords, there is nothing admirable about being even-handed in the face of the suffering of the Anglophone community. The United Kingdom should support the Anglophone community's peaceful civil society leaders in seeking genuine and inclusive talks. We need a targeted strategy for atrocity prevention and, my lords, a commitment to bring to justice those responsible for human rights violations wherever they occur.
My Lords, I too would like to thank my noble friend Lord Boateng for initiating this debate and too for his passionate introduction. I don't want to repeat his excellent background to the complex and contested decolonisation process that he referred to, but as my noble friend Lord McConnell highlighted, particularly since the federal arrangements were scrapped in '72, the English-speaking Cameroonians have complained bitterly that they are politically, economically and linguistically marginalised. And of course the current period of escalating violence and displacement goes back to when lawyers protested that a piece of legislation had not been translated into English, despite the constitutional guarantees. And as the noble Lord Alton mentioned, it has been claimed by the UNHCR that because of the violence, over 26,000 refugees have fled into neighbouring Nigeria. And of course, as my noble friend Lord Boateng said, hundreds of thousands of others have been internally displaced. My Lords, the plight of refugees in Nigeria is increasingly desperate, with insufficient provision of shelter, food and water and sanitation. Could I ask the noble lady, the Minister, exactly what dialogue has taken place with Nigeria over the worsening refugee situation? Also, has the government considered any plans to resettle any English-speaking Cameroonian refugees in the United Kingdom? My Lords, the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, Adama Dieng, stated the crimes committed by both parties need to be properly and independently investigated, and the perpetrators need to be brought urgently to justice. Could I ask the noble lady, the Minister, what assessment has the UK's right to protect focal point made of the situation in Cameroon, and what action has he taken to respond to the rising risk of atrocities? My Lords, in February of this year, the Africa Minister Harriet Baldwin visited Cameroon and urged restraint and de-escalation of the current tensions. France has condemned separatist violence and urged dialogue. And as the noble Lord Waverley asked, what, if any, direct exchanges have there been with the French government to seek a common approach to the Cameroon authorities to achieve this end? If we're both saying the same thing, surely there's grounds for a common approach. As we've heard, the Cameroon went to the polls on the 7th of October after a period of uncertainty. The Constitutional Council declared, not unsurprisingly, on the 22nd of October that President Biya had won a 7th term with 71% or nearly 72% of the vote, which could see him in power at least until he reaches the age of 92. This declaration, of course, was made despite claims from opposition candidates that the election was marred by fraud, including ballot stuffing and voter intimidation. And of course, the intimidation in the English-speaking provinces was widespread and was reported, and it was claimed that the turnout was as low as 5%, and although official figures say it was almost 16%. And of course, at least 18 petitions for a rerun of the election were laid before the Constitutional Council, but each have been rejected by the Council. BIA remains staunchly supported by the West, especially by France, but also the United States, which relies strongly on Cameroon in the fight against Boko Haram. The nature of the insurgency will make it difficult for the state security forces to end the violence. The scorched, as my noble friend highlighted, the scorched earth tactics on both sides only work to further alienate the population. Bearing in mind his age, it is probable Biya will appoint a successor before the next presidential elections. As my noble friend said, there is a need for engagement. Surely this is the time to raise with the president, raise with him what sort of legacy he leaves behind. Will it be one of further violence or of peace? It's an opportunity this government should not miss. In May, Harriet Baldwin said the government was encouraging not only the government there, but all Cameroonians to participate in a process of inclusive dialogue. But how, as my noble friend said, and others in the debate, how is the government translating these words into practical steps? What concrete steps is Her Majesty's government taking in engagement with Cameroon to facilitate a national dialogue and avert the imminent risk of mass atrocities? What dialogue has there been with the African Union? What dialogue has there been with the Commonwealth Secretariat to support initiatives like the one my noble friend mentioned in terms of the Religious Leaders Conference to take place? And we've seen the report from the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative and civil society organisations which reported to the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group. It really is important that we see practical steps taken. But these practical steps cannot be just left to words. They have to be resourced. And that means backing the Commonwealth necessarily with the appropriate resources if we are to make those sorts of commitment. My Lords, in conclusion, I just want to raise one other point, which is in the press release of 8th of June, the International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, hailed the new 1.5 billion natural gas trade deal with Cameroon, seemingly oblivious to the persecution and violence in the region. Now, my Lords, it's right that the UK ought to expand into markets in the region, but in doing so we should consider our responsibility to ensure that trade is used to tackle injustices and eliminate poverty. I would hope that the noble lady, the Minister, can tell us, for example, whether before the agreement was signed, was any assessment made by the Trade Department of the risks that such a deal could pose to human rights in Cameroon. Human rights are being violated. There does need to be strong action on an international basis, and I hope the noble lady, the Minister, will be able to reassure noble lords tonight on that point.
My Lords, may I first of all thank the noble Lord, Lord Boutin, for tabling this debate, and if I may say so, for I thought a very eloquent and powerful speech. And I also thank all other noble lords for their certainly thoughtful and very perceptive contributions. And I would also like to pay tribute to the noble Lord, Lord Boutin's commendable charitable work in Cameroon. Now, before I respond to the specific question of this debate, I should like to emphasise that promoting and defending human rights is a fundamental part of the UK's foreign policy, and some of your lordships raised that question. We believe that everyone everywhere should enjoy equal rights and protections under the law. And standing up for human rights is not only the right thing to do, it's a wise thing to do, because I think human rights are the essential foundation for a fairer, more secure and more prosperous world. And we promote respect for human rights in a variety of ways. We do it from quiet diplomacy and discussions in private to leading campaigns with our international partners. And quite rightly, both the Noble Lords, Lord Botang and Lord McConnell, focused on human rights. My Lords, your Lordships, I think, in individual contributions and collectively, have given a very good commentary on the current situation in Cameroon. Now, there have been tensions between the majority Francophone and minority Anglophone regions since modern-day Cameroon was formed in 1961, and these deep-rooted tensions sadly have intensified in recent years. Protests by teachers and lawyers against the imposition of Francophone education curricula and legal systems in Anglophone Cameroon in October 2016 led to violence, and some Anglophones, as your Lordships acknowledge, are now demanding secession from Cameroon. And to compound these problems, this violent dispute is taking place at the same time that Cameroon is also tackling the threat of Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa in the extreme north and Lake Chad Basin, and supporting tens of thousands of refugees from the Central African Republic and Nigeria, and a number of your Lordships referred to that, who have themselves been displaced by violence. Can I say that I think the causes of the dispute are complex, and as in many conflict situations, it is not always easy to establish accurately what is happening on the ground. And while it is clear that the Anglophone community have legitimate concerns, terrible human rights violations and abuses have been carried out by both sides. And indeed, the Noble Lord, Lord Botang, acknowledged that, as did the Noble Lord, Lord Chichi. Now, in the past year, we've witnessed a heavy-handed state response, as well as a campaign of intimidation and violence by armed separatists. Now, the Noble Lord, Lord Alton, raised a number of, I think, important points, which I feel I must try to deal with. He used the phrase ethnic cleansing. I would say to the Noble Lord, and I know he feels passionately about these matters and he's exceedingly well informed, but I would suggest to him that while there have undoubtedly been human rights violations committed, the British government does not consider the government of Cameroon to be engaged in ethnic cleansing. Now, I don't wish to diminish the severity of the situation, because there is evidence of forced displacement as a result of government security force operations, as well as attempts by armed separatists to create so-called ghost towns. But, my Lords, Cameroon is a deeply heterogeneous country with over 200 ethnic groups, and the linguistic divide, I understand, does not always align with ethnic identity. Some ethnic groups span the Anglophone, Francophone boundary. And the Noble Lord, Lord Alton, also claimed that the United Kingdom was resorting to the phrase of a level playing field. Well, we don't claim this to be a level playing field. We believe the cause of the conflict is clear. It's decades of marginalisation of Anglophones, a deep sense that English language usage is being squeezed from public life, and a heavy-handed security response to legitimate protests. But as the Noble Lord notes, Amnesty International reports that 185 members of the security services have been killed by Anglophone separatists. So we don't claim moral equivalence, but neither can we neglect the role that armed separatists are playing in worsening the situation. And I would suggest to the Noble Lord that we do not claim there to be a binary choice. We think there are a range of options available to the international community, with sustained diplomatic pressure being the starting point. And now that these presidential elections are over, we and our international partners are calling on President Bayer to urgently commit to a process that resolves this crisis. The Noble Lord, Lord McConnell, again very rightly raised the question of protecting human rights and promoting our values globally. Let me reassure him we will continue to encourage all states to uphold international human rights obligations, and we are committed to upholding the UK's high standards, and particularly to full implementation of the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. Now, I think it was the Noble Lord Collins and the Noble Lord Alton inquired about the New Age natural gas deal. Can I say that we do not see that there has to be a choice between securing growth and investment for the UK and also raising human rights? Our experience is that political freedom, dialogue between groups, and the rule of law are vital underpinnings for both prosperity and stability, and that by having a strong relationship with Cameroon, we are able to have open discussions on a range of admittedly difficult issues, including human rights. A number of your lordships referred to the very distressing incident in the school in Bamenda last week. I was pleased to see that the students apparently were quickly released, and the government, the UK government, is urging those responsible to release the teachers, because I understand they are still held. Now, of course, the humanitarian impact of this conflict in the lives of ordinary people is deeply troubling. As many of your lordships have indicated, the consequences are disruptive, they're destabilising, high levels of violence causing many people in the English-speaking areas to flee their homes. And across Cameroon, more than 3.3 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. That is an awesome figure. I mean, to put that in context, my lords, I think that is more than 3 times the population of Birmingham, and that maybe puts this into perspective, the enormity of the problem. And the escalating violence is severely damaging the economy, so the long-term consequences for the country could be catastrophic. Now, I think all your lordships have raised a very legitimate question: what is the United Kingdom doing? And you said you didn't want platitudes and you didn't want just warm words. Well, of course, we are deeply concerned, and it would be ridiculous to say otherwise. We are providing £6.5 million of support to Cameroon for the Lake Chad Basin crisis and the refugees from the Central African Republic. In terms of specific support for the Anglophone crisis, we have provided funding for a humanitarian advisor based in Yaoundé, who will be advising on the humanitarian response as a whole, including food security efforts, nutrition and shelter. And we have also provided funding for a protection advisor in the United Nations Office for the coordination of humanitarian affairs in Cameroon, who will be focusing on protection of civilians in armed conflict. Now, we're closely monitoring the situation. We will reassess what further support we may be able to provide as the crisis evolves. But we are clear that the divisions that are causing the violence and displacement can only be resolved through constructive dialogue. And the Noble Lord Botang is right, I may say, in emphasising that. And I may be able to provide some comfort. I think he raised the question of the forthcoming conference. Now, our High Commissioner has met with Cardinal Toomey, I believe it is, and we encourage his efforts, and we call for all sides to enter into dialogue, and we think this opportunity should be seized, but the government of Cameroon must approve the conference. And the Noble Lord also raised the issue of resource. Well, the Foreign Secretary has announced 1,000 new diplomatic posts. We're currently recruiting across Africa, including in Cameroon. And I think it was the Noble Lords, Lord Chidgey and the Noble Lord Collins, who asked about the Commonwealth. Baroness Scotland engaged with President Biya in December 2017 and pressed for dialogue. And the former Foreign Secretary engaged with the government of Cameroon in April of this year, and with Prime Minister Yang at Chogum, to remind of values and expectations of Cameroon as a Commonwealth member, and called to an end to violence and for dialogue. And I think it was the Noble Lord Lord Collins and the Noble Viscount Waverley who asked about dialogue with France. Well, the Minister for Africa raised with the Minister Lemoyne earlier this year, and President Macron wrote to President Biya post-election to encourage action and offer support for dialogue. Now, I think this is interesting in a step up in pressure, so there has been an international exchange in that respect. A number of your lordships referred to the visit by my right honourable friend, the Minister for Africa, Harriet Baldwin. She used the opportunity to call on the government of Cameroon to take urgent action to address the crisis, She's urged all parties to commit to a peaceful and structured process that addresses the underlying constitutional issues of this dispute. We believe that anything less will simply store up issues for the future rather than solve current problems, and a number of your lordships touched on that aspect. Can I say that at the end of the day, Cameroon is an independent sovereign state, and these issues must be actually determined by Cameroon. I can also reassure the Noble Lord McConnell that my Right Honourable friend Harriet Baldwin, when she visited in February of this year, used the opportunity to reiterate the government's commitment to defending human rights, and she pressed the government ministers to grant humanitarian access to the 47 Anglophone leaders who were then in detention, and I'm pleased to say that following her intervention, the International Red Cross were indeed granted access. My Lords, the UK government is deeply concerned about the situation in Cameroon. We do commend our fellow Commonwealth nation, that is what Cameroon is, for giving shelter to so many refugees from neighbouring countries and for their efforts to tackle the threat of Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa in the Lake Chad Basin. But the government of Cameroon must now step up and deliver real progress on the ongoing crisis within its own borders and for the benefit of all its citizens. I thought the Noble Lord Collins raised a very penetrating question and made a very pertinent point when he said, what is the President's legacy to be? I am absolutely sure the President will reflect on that very question, and I very much hope, as we all do, that the President's legacy is going to be focusing on peace, constructive dialogue, and seeking a way to the end to the turbulence which has so dogged and negatively affected Cameroon.
My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now adjourn.
That the House do now adjourn.
Well, we got it up. And you made well over time. You told me we had 1.5 hours. Well, we did, but it doesn't mean you can go over time.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.